Hello, this is Tuxedo Blackfoot, and today I would like to do a video on Russia, specifically, should we go to war with Russia? This is in part a response to Shadow Katt's video on conflict, and I'm on the same mind with his general idea on conflicts on there, but I don't think we're quite ready to go to war with Russia at the moment. Now, to be clear, I am new at making these videos and I kind of suck at it, but I'm still going to do it. So bear with me, and if you don't like listening to me, don't watch it. So continuing on, my impressions from Shadow Katt's video is that he was very much for going to war with Russia. And though he did have some reservations, and he most certainly didn't think of it as a good thing, by and large, he was for going over and defending Ukraine. This subject has been an interesting one. I see two major camps, and of course, other opinions here and there, as usual, but by and large, there's two major circles. The left, which tends to be establishment Democrats, neocons, status quo types, they are extremely pro-war. The right, and by this I mean generally the populist right, maybe not so much neocons. Neocons can generally be wrapped up with the left. The populist libertarian types tend to be either entirely neutral or extremely anti-war. Styx Hexenhammer is one that's absolutely against any sort of intervention whatsoever. And looking at Dr. Turley, like Dr. Steve Turley, he seems to be extremely neutral on the matter. He's expressed that he doesn't like it and expressed disappointment, but he's refused to even take a side in the situation. I do believe he understands Russia's the enemy, but by and large, he just looks at it as one huge disaster and doesn't go farther from that position. There are a few other positions I've seen here and there. For example, I've seen one ACAB account start saying that Russia was actually the good guys because Nazis exist in Ukraine. Obviously, no country is without issues. In fact, that's one of the strategies that social justice types tend to use. They pick something negative in the history of whatever it is they're attacking, and then they demonize the whole as if the entire group is responsible for that minority. There is no country, no group in the history of mankind that is perfect, that is without its flaws. While the existence of Azov Battalion is something to be considered, I do believe they have some form of government support. It still doesn't color the entirety of the Ukraine military and the Ukraine's fighting force, or even Ukraine civilians. The other position is no response whatsoever. This seems to be the Styx Hexenhammer type solution, that we should do absolutely nothing. We should not impose sanctions. We should not move to prevent this in any way whatsoever. I disagree. Ukraine is an ally. They are not part of NATO, though there was talks about putting them in NATO. And as such, with Russia also being a major world power, it does require some response from other major world powers. If we were talking about two countries that nobody had ever heard of, okay, sure. We can't go around and put ourselves in every conflict on Earth. That's a quick way to lose a lot of lives and get nothing done. But we do have a connection to Ukraine. And this attack on Ukraine isn't entirely, I don't think it's entirely incorrect to say it's not at least partially an attack on the West. So, yes, some sort of response I do believe is required for this. So, in that vein, I'd like to bring up one point, and that is the difference between moral justification and strategic justification. This is one of those things that it's kind of the fault of the English language. There is no, when you say something is somebody's fault, it's not initially clear whether you're saying that what they did is a major moral failing, and even though what they did was successful, what they did was terrible and they shouldn't have done it, or if what they did was morally justified, it was just doomed to fail because it was dumb. It's like the old adage. Were they are they evil or are they just stupid? There is a separation here. And where it concerns the Russia invasion of Ukraine, for the people advocating to send troops in and defend Ukraine, yes, there is moral justification for this. Anyone saying otherwise, well, for all the people on the right against going into Ukraine, I would like to point them to the idea of self-defense, specifically defense of another. When you are in a civilian self-defense situation where you see somebody attacking another person, and you can clearly tell that the person defending themselves is being robbed or the victim of some crime, you are allowed to defend them. And you are allowed to defend them with lethal force should it be necessary. Now, there are caveats. You need to be damn well sure that you know what's going on, so you're not actually attacking the victim. However, in most cases, it's a pretty simple concept. You are allowed to defend somebody that is not yourself from an attack that they are the victim of. My argument is that the long-term consequences of our involvement in Ukraine, while we should take some action, we should not be sending troops and possibly even aircraft over to the area. At least not manned. If you want to give equipment to Ukraine, go ahead. But sending a military force, an American or a NATO military force to defend Ukraine, could have some long-term or even short-term negatives that might just make it to where it would have been better had we never gone at all. First off, we've got the consideration of blowback. Blowback is effectively whenever America involves itself in a foreign affair, when the consequences of that involvement end up hitting us later on. The prime example of this was bin Laden, who was actually trained by the CIA to fight Soviets in Afghanistan, if I remember that correctly. And everyone knows what the end result of that was. You've got not just terrorism funded by bin Laden, but of course 9/11. Ukraine is kind of a similar situation here. I do believe we do actually have people in Ukraine training many Ukrainian fighters at the moment. And of course, we are fighting not so much Soviets, but we are fighting Russia. And The Ukraine does have its own problems. I've already mentioned Azov Battalion, but that is an indication that there are certain elements within Ukrainian society that are not particularly the best to be associated with. And while, as I said, this does not reflect the entirety of Ukraine, it does reflect social problems within the country. We've also got Crimea. Crimea was, of course, Russia's previous incursion into Ukraine. And this happened in part due to a coup within the area. This happened in 2014. So that's about 6 years ago that there was a coup in this country. And violence in Donbass has continued ever since then. So we would be coming to the aid of a country that has known Nazis, which has had a coup within the last 6 years. Yeah, there's a possibility for blowback there. In fact, if we're going to compare this to bin Laden, we are way more involved in Ukraine than we ever were in Afghanistan, the Afghanistan involvement which trained bin Laden. So, this is something we need to be very aware of. While we should be defending and supporting Ukraine, we should also be aware that this isn't a perfect country. Now, for my other reason, direct involvement in Ukraine could lead to an escalation. Currently, the Russia invasion of Ukraine is what could be described as a absolute man-made disaster. We need to minimize this in any reasonable way possible, and sending troops into Ukraine will almost assuredly be an escalation. Russia is, of course, not our only adversary on the world stage. We also have, for example, China. China has been training and beefing up its military in recent years, as well as pushing propaganda. If we intervene in Ukraine, that gives openings for our other adversaries, for example, China. First off, they may decide to join Russia and basically start World War III. As bad as that is, I think it's much more likely they'll end up taking the opportunity while the US is distracted to, let's say, attack Taiwan. As bad as this human disaster of the Russia invasion is, we do not want to turn this into World War III. China has already supported Russia in a number of ways to get around sanctions, and I have no reason to believe they won't do the same militarily. And that's not even on the subject of nukes. Putin has already threatened the use of a nuclear weapon in the invasion of Ukraine. My understanding is that, in general, defenses of against nuclear weapons in specific are illegal due to some, I don't think it's the Geneva Convention, but some sort of agreement. Basically, in the spirit of mutually assured destruction, no country should have a defense against nuclear weapons because that would, of course, invalidate the understanding that you will be destroyed if you destroy another country with a nuclear weapon. But we need to start looking into it. We most certainly need to start looking into making a defense towards nuclear weapons. I believe the Space Force was part of that, um, as terribly named as it was. And I've heard some people claim that moves NATO was making against Russia, in no small part against Russia's nuclear capability, was one reason Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Regardless, we need to double down on whatever it is we're doing to prevent Russia from using nuclear missiles, or discouraging them from doing so. That is almost a mandatory response. We can't not do something against a world power that threatens to use a nuclear missile. That said, while a direct military invasion might be morally justified in this situation, it could also provoke the use of said nuclear weapons. While we should, absolutely should, take actions against Russia threatening to do so, in addition to the invasion of Ukraine, I don't think a direct military response would be the intelligent way to go about this. Now that I've covered what we shouldn't do, I'm going to cover what we should do. First and foremost, we should give any possible aid to Ukraine that we can manage, be it in the form of food, weapons, you name it. Any aid short of sending military forces to Ukraine. In many ways, this is going to be their battle that they are going to have to fight for themselves. And that's true even if we do end up sending military down there, but regardless, we should not just completely abandon them. That is absolutely not what I'm advocating. Secondly, we should do sanctions, even more sanctions than we're currently doing. Now, I do understand there was a certain Stephen Colbert that made a not very intelligent joke. Honestly, what he said to me sounds like satire.
I'm willing to pay $4 a gallon. Hell, I'll pay $15 a gallon because I drive a Tesla.
It feels like when he said that, that kind of sounds to me like he was intentionally making fun of himself in the elite class. But that's just what it sounds like to me. I know the guy's very much on the left, and that's probably something he'd say anyway. Regardless, that does open up the other question: what should we do about oil? Yes, oil is a problem. About a year and a half ago, oil was not a problem. About a year and a half ago, we were exporting oil from the US, and gas prices were the cheapest that they'd ever been, at least within most people's lifetime. Yeah, we should allow the drilling of oil. We should rebuild the pipeline, i.e., the Keystone Pipeline. Maybe try to avoid building it over Indian lands this time, but yes, it should be built. And in that same vein, we could also start looking for alternative sources for other things. I know fertilizer is a major export of Russia, but that also sounds like something we could probably find from another country. Let's take Russia and China off of our possible places of import. We've got the entire rest of the planet. Granted, Russia and China are pretty big countries. I still feel like we should have somewhere where we can find fertilizer. And yes, all of these solutions will take time. However, I feel like it's better to say, hey, that might be difficult in the short term, but there's a exit, compared to, oh, let's just destroy our own economy and do nothing to alleviate the problem except give more money to our smaller enemies? I guess that's a solution. At least better than giving it to Russia. Still still a pretty garbage solution. We can and should start getting these things for ourselves from our own land and have a long-term benefit from this entire situation. Now, I have mentioned sanctions against China. I don't think any rational look at this situation without considering China is a reasonable solution. China and Russia are pretty close. Russia has started using China's system for electronic banking, and I'm not really opposed to sanctions against China, especially against modifying our trade deal with China. China, among other things, is responsible for harboring uh, cyber criminals. China will not release one of their own people for trial in another country, period. And that includes people guilty of cybercrime. China has no problem stealing intellectual property, and I have some complaints about our system of intellectual property, but it also does serve a purpose. China has sent spies to, has been caught sending spies to various government officials. They've bribed university professors for government technology, military technology. They basically employ slave labor. They're not technically slaves, but they're worked to death, literally. I think a lot of people remember the whole suicide nets debacle. And then there's the Uyghur Muslims that, by all accounts, seem to be enduring something of a genocide in China. Why are we still treating China like they're just any other country to trade with? You see, the problem with employing slave labor when dealing with another free market is that slaves are really cheap. When you've got your competitor sending goods off to China to be made by next to nothing slave labor, you're not going to be able to make your product as cheaply, or as there is a question of quality involved, but I'm talking about cost for parts that maybe don't need to be of best quality. If your competitor's sending parts over to be made in China by slave labor, you're not going to be able to compete with them, not in the free market. We need to start looking at tariffs. We need to start looking at sanctions against China, because America is supporting everything China is doing without a second look at it. And this definitely needs to change now that China is supporting the Russia invasion of Ukraine. So that's my attempt at doing a serious video on a serious subject. I don't think they're particularly good at the moment. I do think they're getting a little bit better. This is about the third or fourth one I've done. Regardless. Yes, speaking of Shadow Katt, he's a great content creator. He's a lot better at doing this than I am. If you haven't seen him, you should check him out. I think me and him agree 90% on most things, but I just don't see value in doing a response video on someone and saying, yeah, I agree with everything you said. I have no disagreements whatsoever. No, that's boring. There is a way to respectfully disagree with someone, and I am looking forward to doing that more often, and hopefully it's interesting. So with that being said, check Shadow Katt out in the links. If you like this video, like it. If you hate it, then thumbs it down and make some terrible comment in this comment section. All right, with that being said, I am out. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again next time.